I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. Our topic this week was suggested by Kelly, as I was talking about a new book that I had purchased about haunted hotels. The book is called Haunted Hotels. So she started talking about the Hotel Chelsea located in New York City, and it was one of the featured hotels in the Haunted Hotel book. So I decided to look into it a bit, knowing only a vague outline of its history and infamy. I needed to see if it would be meaty enough for an episode. There is no doubt that there is plenty to talk about when it comes to this hotel. The hotel is known as the Hotel Chelsea, the Chelsea Hotel, or simply just the Chelsea. It was built between 1883 and 1884 in Manhattan, New York City, as one of the first private apartment cooperatives. It was viewed originally as a socialist utopian commune. The building is located at 222 West 23rd Street between 7th and 5th Avenue in the neighborhood of Chelsea. The building was designed by Philip Hubert, and his design is described as Queen Anne Revival and Victorian Gothic. The hotel is a 12-story red brick structure, and at the time it was built, it was one of New York City's tallest buildings. It opened for initial occupancy in 1884 and was certainly a beautiful and impressive structure, with its red brick and its delicate flower-ornamented black iron balconies and the grand staircase that extended up to the 12th floor. Within a few years, the Chelsea went bankrupt due to economic stress, the relocation of the theater district, and the middle-class suspicions about apartment living. The upper Manhattan area had opened up with plentiful houses, and many went there to live. The Chelsea reopened as a hotel in 1905. In 1939, the hotel went bankrupt and was purchased by a group who continued to manage it as a hotel until the early 1970s. It was designated a New York City landmark in 1966, and was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1977. It changed management again in 2007, and was eventually sold in 2011 for $80 million. The new owners stopped taking reservations and began renovations. This was the first time the operations had been stopped in 186 years. It was sold again in 2013 and in 2016, and reopened to guests in February of 2022. In its lifetime, the Hotel Chelsea housed many famous people that included Janis Joplin, Alice Cooper, Jimi Hendrix, Sid Vicious, Dylan Thomas, Leonard Cohen, Andy Warhol, Mark Twain, and the Grateful Dead. I could go on, but you get the idea, and hopefully some of these names are familiar to you. Dylan Thomas was a poet. Leonard Cohen wrote the song Hallelujah. Needless to say, the Chelsea attracted many talented creative people, along with everyday people that stayed there. And with such a long history with people living within its walls, is it a surprise that it's considered one of the most haunted hotels in New York, if not the world? There are those who died at the hotel from natural causes, but there were also other, more tragic passings. In 1908, a woman believed to be Elmira Wilcox was found dead in her room at the hotel. The coroner believed some narcotic was the cause. She hadn't slept in 4 nights and was prescribed drugs to try to help with her insomnia. But unfortunately, they helped her sleep the ultimate sleep of the dead. The following year, in 1909, artist Frank Kavecki blew his brains out after he was robbed of money belonging to the Hungarian Sick and Benevolent Society. when the Carpathia docked at Chelsea Pier 54 with survivors of the Titanic in 1912, some of the survivors stayed at the Hotel Chelsea. One of the wives of one of the men who perished on the Titanic is said to have committed suicide because she was unable to live with the thought of losing her husband. Another tragic death occurred in March 1922. The news article reads, "After cutting off her left hand with a pair of small sewing scissors and throwing it under her bed, Mrs. Etelka Graf, 38, jumped from the 5th floor window of her apartment at the Hotel Chelsea yesterday and landed on the 3rd floor balcony. Her 2 ankles and left arm were fractured, and her head and face severely lacerated. Physicians at Bellevue Hospital were surprised that Mrs. Graf could have stood the pain of amputating her own hand. She had been suffering from a nervous disease. It is thought she was demented at the time of the amputation. Mrs. Graf, an Italian, arrived at the Hotel Chelsea a week ago to visit her aged parents. She came from Paducah, Kentucky, where her husband is in business. She brought her 11-year-old daughter, Cora, with her. In case you're not sure, she did not live." There's a story about this incident that is made up using bits and pieces of the real account and then embellishing it. This is from the 1922 news article from that time and is the true account. If you ever come across a story about Nadia, that is the false story. One of the more well-known deaths associated with the hotel is the death of famed poet Dylan Thomas. October 1953, Dylan Thomas arrived in New York. According to those close to him, he suffered from several different ailments, some associated with his heart. He also had a need to carry an inhaler to treat respiratory problems, and he suffered from alcoholism. During the last weeks of October, Dylan Thomas's friends noted that he was sick. At times he lost his voice. One friend told Dylan that he sounded like Louis Armstrong. Thomas was staying in room 205 at the time, and one night in November 1953, he returned from a night of drinking and said, "I've had 18 straight whiskeys. I think that's the record." The next morning, Dylan Thomas canceled appointments because of his illness, but went out drinking again, though returned early because he was feeling ill. His doctor came to see him 3 times to administer cortisone and morphine. Dylan Thomas ended up turning blue and becoming comatose. He was taken by ambulance to St. Vincent's Hospital, where he was treated for alcohol-related illness. Thomas died 4 days after entering the coma on November 9, 1953. Though many thought the alcohol was what did him in, it was determined that he did not drink 18 whiskeys that night. The most he could have consumed was 8, and most likely the number was 6. We know this because at the time, bartenders had to keep an accurate tally of the amount of alcohol served each night. What Dylan Thomas did die from was bronchitis and pneumonia that he was suffering with weeks before he ended up at the hospital. September 21, 1968, Charles R. Jackson, the author of The Lost Weekend, took barbiturates and died at the hospital from barbiturate poisoning. It was ruled a suicide. I know that these last 2 deaths actually occurred outside the hotel, but I still think they are important. Well, I can say one definitely is, as you'll find out later. In 1974, Billy Maynard, a photographer who specialized in glam rock acts and trans performers like the Cockettes, was beaten to death in his room. And the last death that I want to touch upon is probably the most famous one, and it's a murder, so we have a little true crime here. It's the murder of Nancy Spungen. Nancy Spungen left home at the age of 17 and moved to New York City. She supported herself with sex work, was an amateur music journalist, and had some odd jobs at clothing stores. In her free time, she became a groupie and followed rock bands like Aerosmith, Bad Company, the New York Dolls, and the Ramones. In London in 1975, the punk band called the Sex Pistols was formed. December 1976, Nancy Spungen flew to London with the Heartbreakers and met the Sex Pistols, who later included a bassist named Sid Vicious. When Nancy and Sid met, they became inseparable. Their 19-month relationship was tumultuous. Vicious was already abusing drugs before meeting Nancy, but the two ended up becoming hooked on heroin. Many blamed Nancy for getting Sid addicted to heroin. She was called Nauseating Nancy because of her tendency towards public outbursts. She also seemed to be somewhat controlling of Sid based on the things that I read. The Sex Pistols broke up in January of 1978, and Nancy and Sid ended up moving into the Chelsea, into room 100. They registered as Mr. and Mrs. John Simon Ritchie, which was Sid's real name. After 2 months, the drug use got worse. At 11 a.m. on October 12, 1978, the front desk of the hotel began receiving calls of distress about a situation in room 100. The bellman was sent to see what was going on, and discovered Spungen in her underwear on the floor, bleeding profusely from stab wounds to her abdomen. Sid Vicious was dazed and found wandering the hallway, wailing about how he killed Nancy. He repeated that to police, then recanted, insisting he remembered nothing. It was rumored that Sid owned the knife used in the murder. He had a 007 hunting knife, but the police said the knife that was used was a Jaguar Wilderness K11 with a 5-inch blade. He attempted suicide a few days after the murder. Sid was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, and he pleaded not guilty. He spent 2 months at Rikers and was released February 1979 on bail. He celebrated his release by sending his mother to score some heroin. Talk about being an enabler. 4 months after Nancy died on February 2, 1979, Sid died of a heroin overdose before the trial took place and the case of Nancy's murder was closed. There were other theories about killers other than Sid, including one of 2 drug dealers who were at the room. Robbery was also a possibility because there was a large bankroll missing from the room. People also accused comedian and drug dealer Rockets Red Glare because he had delivered drugs to the room that night. Rockets denied his involvement to the press, but often confessed to the murder within his circle of friends. It's hard to say exactly what happened. Sid and Nancy were hosting a small party the night of the murder. That night, Sid took 30 tablets of a potent barbiturate mix that rendered him unconscious most of the night. While the case is considered closed, it's safe to say there are still many questions about what exactly happened to Nancy. So with all this craziness going on at the Chelsea for decades upon decades, it's no wonder it had become such a hotbed of paranormal activity. A longtime Chelsea hotel resident said, "The ones I thought had interesting stories were the good folks working behind the front desk. They always had to address the ghost problem and move overnight guests from one room to the next. There was always a guest calling the front desk wanting to change rooms due to something they saw or something they felt." One of the night watchmen told a resident a story about a call girl named Victoria, who dressed and styled herself like Betty Boop, and died at the hotel from AIDS. Sometime later, the room's new tenant called the night watchman, asking that her room be changed because she had looked in the mirror and saw the image of Victoria, staring back at her, Betty Boop hairdo and all. One of the hotel's most famous ghosts, meaning that she is seen the most, not that she herself is famous, is Mary. There are a couple of stories about the origin of Mary. One is that Mary was a survivor of the RMS Titanic, and tragically her husband perished in the sinking. Another story, and the one that I think is the most accurate, says that she was not on the Titanic herself, but that she was there to greet her husband. They were from Buffalo, New York, and she had traveled to New York City to welcome her husband home to the States. Instead of greeting her husband, she was given the news of the sinking of the Titanic, and that her husband did not survive. Devastated at the loss of her husband, she went back to her room at the Chelsea and hung herself. Mary is seen in the hallways of the 8th and 5th floors. Sometimes people see her hunched over in the hallway sobbing, and other times she shows up in mirrors. She is seen most often at the western end of the building, under the archway of the hallway, where the original entrance was located. Many times she is seen checking herself in the mirror, which earned her the nickname the Vain Ghost. Michael Imperioli, who played Christopher on the HBO series The Sopranos, stayed at the Hotel Chelsea in 1996, when he broke up with his girlfriend. He was staying in a room on the 8th floor. He had heard other residents and guests mention Mary, and thought she was just another eccentric resident at the hotel that he would eventually meet. Then late one night, while he was returning to his room, he came upon a woman at the end of the hall sobbing. He tried to comfort her, asking, "Are you okay?" At that moment, he heard a loud pop behind him when the bulb blew, and he turned to look at the light. When he turned back to the woman, she was gone. Imperioli described the hallway lights as dim, and the sound of her sobbing as echoing through the whole hallway. She was dressed in an old-time long dress, and he could feel her pain and suffering. A respected Canadian journalist and novelist by the name of Sparkle Hayter had an experience at the Chelsea as well. The site she occupied on the 3rd floor had been previously lived in by a drug dealer who was into bestial porn and had been wanted by the police for imprisoning a woman there. The couple who moved in after this man was known for their violent domestic fights. When Hayter was on her book tour and her apartment was empty, the neighbors from her floor could hear typing going on inside. Hayter herself saw the shadow of a crouched woman in a corner of the room late at night and heard weeping. When she would walk towards the shadow, it would disappear. Artist Jennifer Elise Chaparro shared this account. There was definitely something going on the 10th floor. I could feel the energy. I've had some moments where my hair just stood up and I knew I had to run and get off that floor. One time around 1997, my roommate saw the ghost of a man standing in our kitchen in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. Abstract artist Lindsay Noble lived in room 507 from 2003 to 2005. She had been living there just a short time when she was visited by what she is certain was the ghost of William S. Burroughs, who was an American writer. He was floating above her, and when she inhaled, the ghost inhaled. She then introduced herself, saying, "Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm an artist. I'm going to be living here, and could you please keep the other ghosts out of my room?" It must have worked, because after that, Lindsay never had another ghostly experience. Others weren't so lucky. Remember how poet Dylan Thomas slipped into a coma in the hotel and later died at the hospital a few blocks away? Well, Dylan Thomas most definitely did not go gentle into that good night. A woman and her boyfriend decided to visit New York City and booked a room at the Chelsea. Neither had any prior knowledge of the hotel's haunted history. The first 2 nights of their stay were great. They were quiet and uneventful. But on the 3rd and last night, things were different. They had a late night that night and went to bed around 1:30 a.m. The woman's boyfriend fell asleep immediately, but the woman couldn't fall asleep. She was plagued by a strange, creepy feeling. She said, "I had this immense fear that stayed with me the entire night. I tried to close my eyes and replay an upbeat song in my head, but the eerie thoughts and feelings kept creeping back." Nothing had happened to make her feel that way. The feeling just crept in. She was sweating profusely and her heart was beating nearly out of her chest. She felt like she was not alone. I mean, she wasn't alone because her boyfriend was sleeping next to her, but she felt like there was something else there with them. Suddenly, she heard a door slam loudly and a man yelling, followed by frantic footsteps running down the hallway. She froze. The running continued for about 3 minutes and then was gone. Then she heard footsteps creeping in the room behind her. It continued the entire night. After about 2 hours, she suddenly looked up, and right in front of the bedroom mirror was a head floating mid-air. The head seemed to grimace at her, and the eyes stared almost bug-eyed. The face seemed to be wearing some kind of theater makeup, bright red lips drawn on carefully, white face paint, and tightly coiled black hair. Then the image changed into a black and white version of the face without makeup. She was terrified and retreated under the covers, pressed against her boyfriend and praying for the sun to rise. Wanting to know who the face belonged to, she looked through photos of people who had stayed at the Chelsea. She came to one photo and instantly recognized the face, the grimace, and the sad, large eyes. It was Dylan Thomas. I guess he's there raging against the dying of the light. If you want to know what I'm talking about, you probably should look him up. I happen to also be a poet nerd, along with the paranormal nerd and various other nerd subjects. Other people have reported seeing the floating head of Dylan Thomas. It always disappears after it's been seen. His figure is also seen walking the halls. Residents and visitors have also seen the ghost of Sid Vicious close to the first-floor elevator. Guests also reported activity in and around room 100, where Nancy Spungen was killed. There were large temperature fluctuations, orbs of light, and loud music coming from the room when it was unoccupied. Others have heard loud arguing coming from the room, but upon checking found it empty. Room 100 has since been incorporated into 2 other rooms to keep the curiosity seekers at bay. Afterwards, the manager attempted to rent the rooms out to people who weren't aware of the murder. One couple had a guest over, and the guest noticed that they had one room closed off. The guest asked them what was in the room. They said nothing, and that they didn't even use the room at all, and didn't keep anything in there. They said the room had a bad energy, and the wife said she had seen an eerie glow in there. They said nothing, and that they didn't use the room at all, and didn't keep anything in there. They said the room had bad energy, and the wife said she had seen an eerie glow in there. The next guy who lived there ended up subletting his apartment when he moved to France. But the woman who sublet the apartment called him and said she would absolutely not stay in there another minute. Recently, a mother and her 2 adult daughters stayed at the hotel, and they reported problems with the lights. The lights in their bathroom and hallway went off and on over and over again. Later, they heard a high-pitched woman scream, and a sink kept turning on and off with strange bubbles coming out of the drain. After taking a normal photo, there appeared to be a skeleton peeking out from the closet door. The Star Lounge in the basement area has also seen some activity. Lights go on and off, and objects get moved. There's even been cases of the furniture being rearranged. There are other reports of cold spots and strange gusts of air that come out of nowhere. Some have said they were followed through the halls by phantom footsteps. Personal items were moved or thrown across the room. Lights and TVs turn on and off on their own. Others have heard whispers, muted conversations, screams, and arguing. Other ghostly apparitions include a Depression-era street urchin who kicked a woman in the shin before vanishing, causing her to limp and a bruise to appear. And there's an old-fashioned woman near the ice machine who smelled of patchouli and was sobbing about her beloved. There's also the story of the Gray Man of the Chelsea, as told by a girl who used to babysit for a family. She herself did not live at the Chelsea. She only babysat the young boy who lived there. One night when she was getting ready to end her babysitting night, after the boy's parents and some friends came back home, the girl and the boy's parents and their friends were standing out in the hallway outside the apartment. The boy, who was around the age of 6 or 7, came out of his bedroom and into the hallway. His parents told him to go back to bed, but he wouldn't. Instead, he went to the railing on the stairs and looked up at the skylight. He kept staring up at the skylight and finally said, "Mommy, who is the man up there?" His mom told him there was no one there, but he insisted, "That man, that gray man up there." He was told again there was no one there and to go back to bed. The parents told their friends the boy was just tired, and the friends said their goodbyes and got on the elevator and went down to their floor. In the meantime, the boy had managed to climb onto the railing and somehow balanced there. His father grabbed him and took him down before he could fall. The boy started shaking and shivering all over as the parents both held him. It was almost as though he was having a seizure, and he peed his pants. According to the babysitter, the boy had changed after that. He was like a zombie, and at times would go into a violent rage. If he got out into the hallway, he always tried to climb on the railing, almost like he wanted to climb there to jump to his death. The girl felt that who or whatever the gray man was had possessed the young boy. She continued to babysit him for a time until the boy bit and stabbed her in the hand with a pair of scissors. Eventually, the family moved away. During one of the boy's calm, lucid moments, the babysitter asked who the gray man was, and he simply said, "He's Smoke." One time a medium was brought to the Chelsea to see what or who she came across. In the lobby, she said there were half a dozen spirits hanging around, hoping every day that someone would notice them. They were lonely and anxious to be recognized. In the elevator, she saw someone lurking there in the corner. This is, of course, the area where Sid Vicious is seen. In a room on the 3rd floor, she picked up that a murder or beating had occurred in the room and warned others to stay away. One person, however, opted to shower in the room's bathroom and ended up with deep scratches on her chest. If a medium tells you that there's been a violent murder in a room and you shouldn't go in there, don't go take a shower in the bathroom. That's just dumb. You will not find me ever doing that, knowingly. Writer Thomas Wolfe stayed at the Chelsea more than once. Then in July 1938, he developed pneumonia while visiting his brother in Seattle. By September, he was admitted to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to be treated for military tuberculosis of the brain. He died there September 15th, just shy of his 38th birthday. But despite the fact that he died in Baltimore, his ghost is seen in the Chelsea Hotel that he loved. His ghost walks the hallway on the 8th floor, where his room was located. He stayed in room 831. There's also a young girl in white Victorian-style nightgown floating through the halls and weeping, desperate to share her story with someone. And then there is Larry, the so-called hipster ghost. Larry dates from sometime in the 1960s, based on his clothing style and speech. He dominates the spirits, pushing in front of the others and speaking loudly over them so that a visiting medium can hear him. He told the medium that his name was Larry, and he told her, "It's not about the art, man, it's about the life." He also warned of an evil presence in the basement of the hotel. Larry also says that everything inside the hotel is real, and everything outside the hotel doors is an illusion. Larry the hipster ghost also says that there is indeed something underground at the hotel. Long, long before the Chelsea Hotel was built, there is some power that is the genesis of the Chelsea Hotel's creative power. Is it any wonder why Janis Joplin said, "A lot of funky things happen at the Chelsea"? By the way, Janis Joplin's ghost is also sometimes seen walking the halls. And on that note, that's going to do it for this episode. You can find Lurk wherever you find your other favorite podcasts, and on lurkpodcast.com, where you can find episodes and links to our social media. We also have a YouTube channel if you prefer to listen that way, so make sure you subscribe. We have some events coming up late summer and fall, and once we have solid confirmation, I'll share those details with you. And if you like what you hear, please tell a friend. And until next time, keep lurking.